The wealthy rancher never wanted the wedding that chained his fate. It was not love that led him to the altar, but the iron grip of his greedy kin. Uncles drunk on whiskey, brothers blinded by gold, a mother whose heart had long been sold to ambition. They whispered of alliances, of land that could be gained, of profit that could swell their coffers, and so they forced his hand, binding him to a stranger no one knew. She was no dazzling beauty as the family had imagined. Her figure was plain, her eyes too quiet, her steps too soft. Yet when she walked into that ranch house, she carried with her a silence sharper than any blade. At first, the rancher despised her presence, thinking her nothing more than another burden forced upon his shoulders, but the truth of her was hidden deep, like storm clouds gathering far beyond the horizon. She ate little, spoke even less, and moved through the house like a shadow, watching every face at the dinner table, listening to every lie his family spoke, memorizing the patterns of their greed. The workers began to notice her eyes, the way they flicked to the ledgers when cattle went missing, the way they lingered on his brother when he slipped away at night, the way her lips tightened when his uncle spoke of secret deals in town. Strange things stirred in those days, horses bolting in the dark, accounts found ruined, riders slipping into the hills with whispers of betrayal, and through it all she remained silent, never confronting, never accusing, simply watching as if she were a hunter waiting for prey to step into the trap. The rancher himself, though proud and stubborn, began to feel the weight of her presence, for in the quiet moments he would find her in the stables or by the fire, writing into a small leather book she kept hidden, and once, when he asked her what she wrote, she looked at him with eyes like cold embers and said, "Storms don't just fall from the sky." He did not understand then, but soon he would. His family grew bolder, his brother vanishing for days with gold he could not explain, his uncle whispering with merchants about cattle sold under false names, his mother writing letters sealed with secrecy, and whenever the rancher tried to confront them, they mocked him, told him he was nothing without them, nothing without the marriage they had forced upon him. Yet when they laughed, the stranger bride would sit quietly at the edge of the table, her gaze heavy upon them, her silence cutting deeper than any curse. And then the storm broke. One night in the stables, her hand upon his horse, she whispered, "They'll destroy you. They destroyed me once. Now, I will destroy them." For the first time, he saw the fire in her eyes, and fear gripped him, not of her weakness, but of her strength. Days turned like grinding wheels, and suddenly the empire his family had built began to crumble as if unseen hands pulled every stone apart. His uncle dragged before the sheriff for theft, his brother ruined in a saloon scandal, his mother abandoned. By the allies she thought loyal. Through it all, she moved with quiet purpose, whispering to ranch hands, sending letters of her own, guiding events with the precision of someone who had planned this for years. Finally, on a storm-lit night, she stood before the fire and revealed the truth. Years ago, his family had cheated her father of his land, driven her mother to an early grave, left her to starve and vanish, but she had not vanished. She had waited, and now she had returned, not as a helpless bride, but as vengeance itself. She showed him the proof in her leather book, every lie, every crime, every betrayal inked in neat lines, and with steady voice she said, "They forced you to wed a stranger. What they never expected was that the stranger would be their ruin." By dawn, it was done. His uncle fled in disgrace, his brother stripped of his name, his mother broken in silence, and the workers now stood with her, loyal to her strength. The rancher, who once thought her nothing but a weight, now saw her as the storm itself, the reckoning his family had earned. And as the sun rose red across the horizon, she stood on the porch with the fire of victory in her eyes. He no longer saw her as a stranger, but as destiny, one carved not by his family's greed, but by her vengeance. And though her revenge was complete, The story in her silence promised that this was not an ending, but a beginning, one that would bind them, not in chains of force, but in the steel of fate. The rancher had always been a man of pride, hardened by years of sun-scorched days and nights spent taming wild herds. Yet even his iron will broke the day his own family shackled him with a marriage he did not choose. They were greedy men, brothers, who had squandered their shares, uncles who dreamed only of land and cattle they had not earned, a mother whose tongue spoke only of alliances, contracts, and heirs. They mocked him, taunted him, told him he was nothing without their schemes, and so they forced him into the arms of a stranger, a woman they called fat, plain, and undesirable, as though her worth was nothing more than the size of her waist or the cut of her dress. On the night of their wedding, he could barely look at her, his chest burning with resentment, his jaw locked in silence, while his family smirked and whispered over their wine. But she, the stranger bride, did not flinch, did not protest, did not weep. She sat with her back straight, her gaze calm, as though she had already measured the weight of every soul in that room and found them wanting. At first, he resented her presence, turning his eyes away whenever she passed, refusing to speak beyond the sharp commands of a man protecting his pride. Yet she did not answer pride with pride. She answered it with patience. She moved quietly through the ranch, tending to tasks others ignored, mending clothes, helping ranch hands, watching accounts, and speaking with a kindness that felt foreign in a house poisoned by greed. Slowly, against his will, he began to notice that her silence was not weakness, but discipline, and her hands, though soft, carried strength. His family, blind in their arrogance, mistreated her openly. His brothers mocked her for her looks. His uncles dismissed her presence. His mother scolded her for things she had not done. Yet she bore it all with a composure that unsettled him, because beneath her calm was a fire waiting for its time. As weeks passed, he began to see what she saw, that his family's laughter was hollow, their words twisted, their business riddled with secrets. One by one, she uncovered their sins, though never loudly. A ledger hidden under his uncle's bed that showed stolen profits, a letter tucked into his mother's drawer that betrayed alliances with enemies, a bag of gold his brother could not explain. She shared none of this immediately, not even with him. Instead, she waited, watched, and gathered truth like arrows in a quiver. It was only when the rancher himself grew restless, when the shadows around him began to choke him, that she leaned close and whispered the words that changed everything. They think I am weak. They think I am nothing. But they do not see what I see, and when the time comes, their power will crumble. Her eyes in that moment were sharper than any knife he had ever drawn, and for the first time, he realized she was not his family's pawn, but their reckoning. Then the storm came. The uncle who bragged of his schemes was dragged away by lawmen who had been given the very proof the bride had collected. The brother who swaggered in saloons was caught in scandal, his name spat in the dirt. The mother who thought herself untouchable found doors closed and allies vanished, her letters exposed. Each fall was precise, swift, and merciless, as though she had written the script long before she stepped foot in the ranch house. And through it all, the rancher watched, torn between awe and fear, because while his kin crumbled, she stood taller, not as the quiet stranger they had scorned, but as the woman who had held their ruin in her hands all along. When the dust settled, when the empire of greed had collapsed into ashes, she revealed the truth of her revenge, not through rage, but through calm certainty. She had not come to be their servant, nor to be mocked as a fat stranger. She had come because justice demanded it. She had come to tear down the house of cruelty, and she had done so not with shouting or violence, but with patience, cunning, and truth. The rancher, who once could not bear to look at her, now found himself unable to look away. Where he had seen burden, he now saw strength. Where he had seen weakness, he now saw fire. and in the wreckage of his family's greed, he realized he was no longer chained by their will, but freed by hers. At dawn, when the sun burned gold across the plains, she stood on the porch with the wind in her hair, her eyes steady and unbroken, and he knew then that the woman forced upon him had not only saved him from his kin, but had awakened something in him long buried, a respect deeper than pride, and a love forged in the fire of her revenge. The wealthy rancher was a man whose very name carried weight across the plains, a man who had wrestled land from the wilderness and carved fortune out of dust and cattle. Yet all his pride, all his strength, all his stubborn will could not free him from the snare his own family had cast. For on one fateful evening they forced him into marriage with a woman he had never seen before, a stranger whose face carried no beauty by their standards and whose name meant nothing to the men who measured worth only in gold. His brothers laughed as they told him it was for his own good. His uncles patted his back with greasy hands and whispered of alliances that would expand their empire. His mother sighed in false sorrow and claimed she only wanted to see her son settled. But beneath their words was the rot of greed, and the rancher knew it. Yet he had no choice, for they had bound his cattle, his ledgers, his contracts into knots that could strangle even the proudest man. And so he stood at the altar with a jaw clenched like iron, while the church doors opened and the stranger bride entered, plain and quiet, her dress simple, her hair tied back, her steps measured. The crowd murmured, his kin smirked, and the rancher told himself she was nothing but another chain, another humiliation laid upon his shoulders. Yet as she lifted her eyes, just for an instant, they did not rest on him, but on his family, and in that gaze was something sharp, something cutting, something that did not belong to a meek bride. He did not notice it fully then, blinded by his own fury, but that look would return to haunt him. Their vows were spoken, their hands bound, the contract sealed, and the rancher rode back to his sprawling house with a stranger by his side, a woman he swore he would never love, never trust, never allow into the fortress of his heart. At first, she seemed exactly what they believed her to be, silent, yielding, moving softly through the halls like a shadow that dared not disturb the air. She ate little, spoke less, and never raised her voice in protest even when his family mocked her openly, calling her plain, fat, useless, a burden. His brothers sneered when she passed, his uncles ignored her, his mother sighed with disdain, and the rancher himself avoided her gaze, thinking her silence a weakness. Yet the workers on the ranch began to notice things he did not. How her eyes lingered on the ledgers when accounts did not balance. How she stood watching the cattle, pens when gates were mysteriously left open. How she observed his brother's return from town with pockets heavy with unexplained gold. She asked small questions in the kitchens, spoke kindly to the hired hands, listened to the whispers of men who had no reason to lie to her, and slowly, piece by piece, she wove a net of knowledge so fine no secret could slip through. Still she said nothing, never accusing, never confronting, and the rancher dismissed her silence, thinking she was too timid to fight, too meek to resist. But in truth, she was waiting, watching, gathering the weapons of truth and patience. Strange events began to shake the ranch, cattle missing from the herds, horses found untamed and wild in the mornings, contracts broken without warning, merchants whispering of deals gone sour. The rancher, proud and quick-tempered, tried to confront his kin, but they laughed at him, told him he was imagining shadows, mocked him for being paranoid. His uncle swore the cattle were sold honestly. His brother claimed the gold came from gambling luck. His mother insisted the letters she sent at night were nothing but family affairs. Alone, the rancher began to feel the noose of betrayal tightening, and it was then that he started to notice his stranger bride more closely. He found her one evening in the stables, standing with her hand on the mane of his finest horse, her leather-bound book open in her other hand, and when he demanded to know what she was writing, she looked at him with calm fire in her eyes and said, "Storms do not just fall from the sky." Her voice was steady, not meek, and it struck him like a whip. That night he could not sleep, for he began to realize her silence was not emptiness, but a wall, hiding a mind sharper than any knife. The weeks dragged on, heavy with tension, and the rancher saw the mask of his family slip further with each passing day. His younger brother vanished again and again, coming home reeking of whiskey, pockets full of blood-stained gold. His uncle whispered with strangers in town, making deals under false names. His mother sent riders at midnight, carrying letters, sealed in red wax. The rancher felt rage and despair twist inside him, but every time he raised his voice, his family struck him down with words, reminding him that he was nothing without their contracts, nothing without the marriage they had forced on him. Yet whenever they laughed in triumph, the stranger bride sat at the edge of the table, her gaze steady, her lips curved not in fear, but in something colder, sharper, as though she already knew how their game would end. Then the first blow fell. A sheriff rode up one morning with warrants in hand, dragging his uncle before the law on charges of theft, armed with proof so detailed no denial could stand. Days later, word spread from the saloon that his brother had been caught cheating men out of their earnings, his reputation ruined, his name spat in every corner of town. Merchants turned away from his mother's letters, revealing her alliances with enemies, leaving her humiliated and abandoned. One by one, the pillars of the family's power cracked, splintered, and collapsed, as though guided by an unseen hand. The rancher did not need to ask whose hand it was. He saw his stranger bride move with quiet confidence, whispering to ranch hands, sending her own letters sealed with wax, her plain face masking the fury and precision of a woman who had waited years for this. When he confronted her in desperation, demanding answers, she looked at him with eyes that burned and said only, "They thought I was nothing. They thought I was gone. But I remember everything." It was on a storm-soaked night that she revealed her truth. Lightning split the sky. Thunder shook the windows, and in the parlor she stood before the fire, her leather book open in her hands. Her voice, steady and cold, cut through the crackle of flames as she told him the story. Years ago, his family had cheated her father out of his land, stolen his home, left her mother to wither in grief and die in poverty. She had been a girl, then cast aside, forgotten, forced to beg, forced to vanish into shadows. But she had not vanished. She had grown, she had waited, she had learned to watch, to listen, to endure, and now she had returned, not as a helpless bride, but as a stranger cloaked in silence, carrying their ruin in her hands. She showed him the pages of her book, filled with proof of every theft, every betrayal, every deal, every crime his kin had committed. "They forced you to wed a stranger," she said, her voice sharp as steel. "What they never expected was that the stranger would be their destruction." By dawn, her work was complete. His uncle's name was a curse, his brother's pride broken, his mother's schemes shattered, and the workers who had once bent under cruelty now stood beside her, loyal not to greed but to the strength she had shown. The rancher, who had once despised her, who had once believed her silence weakness, could no longer deny what she was. Not a burden, not a pawn, but the storm itself, the reckoning his family had earned. As the sun rose over the plains, painting the sky with fire, she stood on the porch, her figure unyielding, her eyes calm, yet burning with the promise of more. And in that moment, the rancher understood that she had not only destroyed his family's empire of lies, she had set him free. From chains he had not known bound him. She was no longer a stranger. she was destiny itself. And though her revenge had been exacted, the silence within her still whispered of battles yet to come, of a life reshaped not by force, but by fate. And as he stepped beside her, no longer with resentment, but with respect, he knew the truth. The family had tried to bind him to weakness, but instead they had bound him to power, and their ruin had become his salvation. The wealthy rancher had lived his whole life with pride carved deep into his bones. A man who had built herds that stretched across the horizon, who had weathered drought and storm without bowing. Yet even his iron will cracked the night his family shackled him to a marriage he did not choose. For his brothers, his uncles, even his mother, drunk on greed and swollen with schemes, forced him to stand at the altar beside a woman he did not love, a woman they mocked as plain and unworthy, a stranger they believed could be bent like dry grass. The rancher clenched his jaw, his heart burning with rage, vowing that this union was a chain he would never accept. And yet when she entered the church in her modest dress, head bowed, steps measured, he felt the sting of humiliation as whispers rippled and his kin smirked with cruel delight. He told himself she was nothing, just another pawn in their game. But when she lifted her gaze, steady and unflinching, and met his eyes for only a moment before turning it upon his family, he felt a spark he could not name. The wedding passed. In silence, the vows spoken like sentences of exile, and he brought her back to his sprawling ranch house with bitterness in his chest, refusing even to look at her as they crossed the threshold. At first, she seemed exactly as they had expected. Quiet, patient, slipping into the house like a shadow, making no demands, answering cruelty with silence, and the rancher hardened his heart, believing she was too weak to matter. His family mocked. Her openly, his brothers scoffing at her plainness, his uncles dismissing her worth, his mother treating her as a servant, but she endured without protest, and the rancher mistook her composure for meekness. Yet little by little he began to see what others did not, how she walked among the ranch hands and earned their trust, how she fixed what his family broke, how she tended to cattle with a gentleness that calmed even the wildest beasts, how she studied the ledgers late at night with a sharp eye that caught mistakes no one else had noticed. Where he saw a stranger, the workers saw a leader. Where his family saw weakness, the land itself seemed to recognize her strength. And as days turned into weeks, the rancher, despite himself, began to feel the weight of her presence, the quiet, power in her patience, the fire she kept banked behind her calm eyes. His family grew restless, their greed gnawing louder than ever, schemes hatched in shadow, cattle stolen, contracts forged, whispers with enemies in town. But every time they struck, she was there, watching, learning, weaving their downfall, with a steady hand. He confronted her once in anger, demanding to know what she was doing, and she looked at him with fire in her eyes and said, "I do only what must be done. You will understand when the time comes." He could not sleep that night, her words echoing in his skull, for they carried not fear but certainty. And then the storm broke. His uncle was dragged into court with proof of theft so detailed no denial could stand. His brother's name was shattered in town after scandal exposed his lies. His mother's letters were revealed, leaving her allies to abandon her. One by one, the family that had forced his hand collapsed beneath the weight of their own greed, and at the center of it all stood the woman they had scorned, the stranger who had carried patience like a sword and turned silence into fire. On a night when thunder rolled and rain lashed against the windows, she told him the truth, that his family had once wronged hers, cheated her father of land, broken her mother's spirit, and left her to vanish in shadows, and she had returned, not to be their servant, but to reclaim what was stolen, to bring justice where none had been. "They forced you to marry me," she said, her voice sharp as steel, "but they never imagined I would be the storm that ended them." And as dawn rose over the plains, the empire of greed lay in ruin, the workers now loyal to her, the ranch freed from chains, and the rancher, who had once hated her, now stood beside her, seeing not a burden, but a woman forged in fire, a woman whose strength had burned away lies and left only truth. For the first time in 20 years, he felt something stir in his chest that was not anger or pride, but respect, even love. And as she stood on the porch with the sun lighting her face, he knew he had not been forced into ruin, but into destiny, and that their story, born of cruelty and revenge, had become something stronger than either of them had imagined. A bond forged in fire, unbroken and unbreakable.